They put the photograph on the first slide of every feed. Ethan Cole laughing in the rain, arm around Skyler Moon, neon barlight catching the actress's hair like a halo. Under it, 1,000 small sharp captions: cheating, scandal, runaway heir. 2 frames later, another image, a white USB thumb drive on a sticky floor. A pair of broken glasses beside it, a smear of lipstick like a fingerprint. Headline overlays scrolled by like a verdict. Second young master spotted with actress, Bell bride-to-be humiliated. In the corner of the screen a single line, Clara Bell. What does she know? Clara read the headlines again because she couldn't look away and because every look felt like a cut. The feed glittered and spat, and the apartment around her, her books stacked like small barricades, the kettle still warm, a chipped mug she had bought with the last of a summer's wages, seemed to shrink until it was all eyes and noise. Rain had begun outside, the mid-autumn storm that always sounded like memory, and each thunderclap made the city shudder. On her phone, a message from her grandfather blinked. "Clara, your path is not easy. Remember why we made the promise?" The judgment in that small sentence was a hand at her shoulder and a weight in her chest. For as long as she could remember, there had been agreements pre-printed into her life. Her parents, quiet people who'd loved her in the soft way grandparents do, had taken comfort from alliances. Bell and Cole, 2 names braided together across a dinner table once, a remedy for uncertainty, a promise that when one faltered, the other would hold. When the accident took them both 3 years ago, the pact didn't die with them. It nested into Clara's future, a place to belong and a list of duties she never asked to sign but learned to carry, as if it had always belonged to her. There were photographs of her parents at the pact signing, smiles taut with the same kind of resignation she saw on the faces of the elder Bells now. Trust this child, because the world has nothing else to offer. Ethan had been the easy part of that arrangement in the beginning. He was the younger son, the one who made it all feel lighter with his reckless grin and offhand jokes. As a child he'd wrestled with Clara's books, ripping a corner of a worn page to use as a kite. He'd promised her a different life, one with late-night laughter and private jokes and no more arrangements. When he grew older, he turned that easy laugh into armor. He refused the engagement with a flippant note and a bottle of scotch, saying he wanted to live in a world of his own choosing. For a while he did, driving through neon nights with no thought for tomorrow, sleeping with actresses, courting scandal as if it were sport. Skyler Moon was bright, hungry for headlines and parts, and the kind of validation Ethan found intoxicating. When images of Ethan and Skyler arrived, arms tangled, mouths closed, soaking in a rain that looked cinematic under the fluorescence, the tabloids set the match. For the Bell family, it was not only a personal humiliation, but a public unraveling. The same circuits that carried gossip wound through boardrooms. Projects stalled, a major partner hesitated, investments cooled. At the same time, news came of Liam Bell's accident abroad, an executive down, a family patriarch away from the helm, and the company stumbled into a fissure that made the tabloids look like picnic chatter. Bell Corporation, which had been the backbone of 100 livelihoods, had suddenly been rendered fragile. Julian Cole arrived in the eye of this storm the way a well-built ship finds a lee. He was older by 5 years, steadier, the one with the boxy suits and a laugh that didn't clip off like Ethan's. If Ethan was flame, Julian was kindling and mortar, the practical heir who had always seen people and choices as problems to be solved. He had an air of inevitability, born into authority, refined into resolve. When Clara met him at the long family table for the first time after the accident, he did not look at her like a man who had been told to do a favor. He looked at her as if he already saw how the pieces might fit. "You know what the board needs," Julian said quietly that afternoon, the rain a low drum at the windows. His voice didn't try to charm, it catalogued. "Someone with a clean public image, a connection to the Bells who can stand as a face while we repair the rest." It was an offer wrapped in logic. It was a map to safety in a language Clara had learned as a child. Duty, repair, trust. But there were other notes in the way Julian spoke. Respect, an honest reluctance, an awareness that this was not about saving his family alone, but about giving her a place that could shelter her too. He wasn't asking her to disappear. He was proposing an alliance. The paper already existed. The signature was what would make it public. Her decision that night was less surrender than arithmetic. The family needed stability. The company needed direction. Her grandfather's trembling hands needed assurance. There was also something more private at stake. Clara had inherited a cautious courage when her parents died, a tendency toward quiet risk in the name of survival. Marriages of old, she had been told, were not always built on luminous romance, but they could be bonds of mutual protection and mutual dignity. She could refuse and watch the House of Bell wobble and perhaps collapse. She could accept and become a leaver. She could do it for duty, for herself, or for both. She chose, not because she had nothing to lose, but because she wanted something different than fear. When the wedding certificate went online 3 days later, there was a new set of murmurs. Julian's people had arranged for the press release before the ink dried. A small ceremony, a public statement, a promise to focus on the business. The photograph that accompanied the announcement showed Clara in a simple dress, a quiet smile anchored by the flash of a ring on her finger. Julian stood close, protective without possessiveness. It was effective. The optics shifted. People liked neat patterns, and a marriage made the story straighter for headlines. Scandal, yes, solution, now clearer in public view. She married her cheating ex's brother. The caption looked ruthless, as if the world had to make a villain and a winner out of them all. But the truth lived in the thin spaces the tabloids ignore. Clara at her kitchen counter, chin on the back of her hand, trying to reconcile the sudden richness of her title with the loneliness that stole into rooms at night. Julian's hand on her back when she rose for a board acceptance felt less like ownership and more like ballast. He did not smother, he steadied. If the world expected a Cinderella to either sink beneath the glare or to play the part of the grateful bride, Clara intended to do neither. She walked into the mansion with the same care she had used to pack her thin boxes from student life, organized, deliberate, attentive to what she wanted to keep. Julian's staff took her measurements and introduced her to colleagues. The mansion smelled of old wood and coffee and a faint citrus note from a diffuser. Portraits stared down from the walls, faces that had made deals, held councils, made people step in line. It would have been easy to feel small in their presence. Instead, Clara felt like a newcomer in a room she was learning to furnish not only with gowns and furniture but with decisions. Rumors followed anyway. The internet was a patient hunter. Clips of Ethan singing badly at a rooftop party with Skyler were annotated with cruel jokes. On campus, whispers skittered between study groups like insects. A friend texted a screenshot. Someone had posted a blurry picture of a woman on a bar stool next to a white USB. "They're saying she lost her keys and left that on the floor," the caption read. The photograph was grainy. The context, as always, could be embroidered into whatever story the viewer wanted to tell. Clara felt those threads tug at her life. Some mornings she woke with a fist clench of dread. Other days she walked with a new kind of armor. Her own hands pressed together so her fingers would not shake at the sight of a camera flash. The USB was a small object that ended up meaning a lot. It entered the narrative like a rumor itself, slipped into footage, tweeted as if it were gossip, passed from hand to hand under the glow of phone screens. Someone, no one she could name with certainty, left it at the bar where Ethan and Skyler had been photographed. It might have belonged to an onlooker, a journalist, a dealer of secrets. No one offered a straightforward chain of custody, but in the age of viral scandal, ambiguity is fuel. Clara found herself awake at 3 a.m, staring at the yellowed envelope with their wedding certificate inside. Julian slept on the other side of the bed, an even breadth of breath and a low silhouette. She could hear his watch tick, like someone counting the hours of precaution. The world had watched them sign a contract, and had not yet allowed the private line between them to remain private. A notification chimed. Another drone of outrage. A story. USB found near scandal site. What does it contain? A different story. Ethan's night out. Exploit or escape. Each headline edged a little closer to the family, to the company, to Clara herself. She thought, with a cold clarity, about how truth in these circles was less about facts than about who told the story loudest. The night at the bar the week that followed is one Clara could still not fully piece together. Memory offered her fragments, the laughter, the heat of a crowded room, the stale sweetness of an old cocktail. Julian had instructed her to remain cautious and to avoid public appearances. She had agreed. And then, under the invisible pressure of being young, tired and newly famous for all the wrong reasons, had stepped out with a friend. They stayed some time. A drink, two, then a wave of vertigo behind the eyes. A black line. The rest is a collage of other people's recollections. Someone saying she slurred words and stumbled. A bouncer offering an apologetic arm. A girl with a camera saying, "She's had too much." The feed filled with commentary within an hour. She woke to sunlight that had no right to be so tender. The curtains were drawn just enough to slice a rectangle of light across the bed. For a moment she believed she was back in the room she'd always known, the small apartment with its one sagging couch, until she realized the sheets were unfamiliar, the room too orderly, the air smelling faintly of lemon polish and Julian's cologne. She was in his bedroom. Julian's hand hovered over a glass of water on the nightstand, as if giving her room to decide. He watched her with an expression that was hard to pass, concern, deferral, and a protective distance that refused to cross into ownership. "You scared me," he said, and the words were not possessive. He had called a driver when she didn't answer. He had closed the blinds. He had waited till the roommate, one of the house staff, found her keys and shoes. He had not used the episode as ammunition. He had used it as shelter. Clara's embarrassment was a tight physical thing that made her cheeks burn. "I remember the music," she murmured, not ready to parse the rest. She was grateful and furious with herself, and oddly relieved that Julian's care came without a sermon. He did not ask for an explanation beyond what she wanted to offer. He did not probe for secrets. His kindness was practical. A bowl of broth, a blanket, the offer of a shower. "People will say what they want," Julian said at one point, as if naming it would blunt the teeth of rumor. "But we can control the narrative that matters." It was an ugly little line about control, but it was also a promise, an offer of a way forward through this landscape of public scorn. Clara accepted the bowl and, in accepting, allowed herself to be steadied. There was no romantic gloss. There was instead a mutual recognition of fragile things, a woman who had been bruised by gossip and a man with resources willing to place them at her back. Work became the refuge that the tabloids could not reach. Julian did not thrust her into meetings the way some husbands might parade a bride. He arranged introductions. He sat in on her first board briefing, not to hold her hand, but to let her stand in the light. The company's problems were complex in a way tabloids seldom grasped. A fund had been diverted, not by accident, but by calculated misdirection. A partnership deal that should have closed stalled when key signatures were mysteriously delayed. Bell's portfolio of renewable projects was suddenly at risk. There were whispers of sabotage, competitors who would see profit in Bell's fall, advisors who had their own shadowed loyalties. Clara learned quickly. She read financial reports until her eyes stung and taught herself to distinguish a quarterly dip from a crippling hemorrhage. She sat through meetings where men in grey suits said things like liquidity and credit lines and discovered that business was another kind of social engine, one that could devour reputations as readily as it consumed capital. Julian assigned her a small team. A public relations director with calm hands and a legal advisor who smelled faintly of coffee and a past that included high-stakes lawsuits. They were competent, and they treated her with a mixture of respect and the professional cool that comes from dealing with raw nerves. The PR strategy was methodical. Stage 1, control the optics, release measured statements, curated images, and a clear timeline. Stage 2, contain the smear. File defamation claims where necessary, threaten suits to make tabloids think twice, and where possible, feed proper narratives to reputable outlets. Stage 3. Investigate. Whoever had planted the USB, whoever had timed contracts to stall, these were not accidents, but tactical strikes. The legal team began to assemble a trail, server logs, bank transfers, a paper trail that ran like a river back into the mouths of certain rival firms. The USB was too convenient to ignore. It had been photographed and passed around like a talisman. Inside, once a forensics team touched it, there were files, video snippets, a folder of emails, names that blinked like red flags. No single file contained a smoking gun. The evidence was not cinematic. It was administrative, the kind of thing that demanded patience, an invoice mismatched to a supplier, a timestamp inconsistent with official logs, a transfer routed through a shell company with ties to a rival. It suggested intention, but it did not shout it. It required work, analysis, corroboration, an explanation of why those numbers mattered. Julian's counsel cautioned against posting a theory without proof. Julian himself favored slow, precise moves. "We expose the facts, not the story we want," he said. Ethan watched all of this from a different orbit. The showmanship that once made him magnetic now made him a figure of pity in certain circles. He had never expected the consequences of his choices to land with such ferocity. The world had been kind to his risk-taking when it read like adolescence. It was cruel when it suggested a pattern. He found himself sitting alone in rooms he used to fill with noise, with his phone screen a mirror reflecting his absence in the family ledger. There were moments when he tried to charm back into people's lives. An apology offered in a bar, an earnest message sent in the middle of the night to someone who no longer answered. He stalked the feeds, read comments about Clara's new life, and felt something tighten in his throat that wasn't anger. It was a hollow, a recognition that a life he had assumed would open for him had slammed a door in his face. He was not cruel by nature, he was reckless, and recklessness has its own brand of self-sabotage. When he saw the wedding certificate posted on the family's feed, a calm photograph, and an announcement framed in sober prose, something inside him shifted. He had chosen defiance. The choice now bore a price. Clara, for her part, rarely thought of revenge. The idea of revenge felt old and tired, a bait for headline-hungry scripts. What animated her was something steadier. A desire not to be plucked apart by strangers, to claim a role not of victim, but of actor. She wanted to protect the people who depended on Bell's balance. She wanted to cash in on the dignity she'd been given, to turn it into influence that did not require her to be smaller. At night, sometimes, when the mansion dimmed and the portraits watched in that solemn, unblinking way of old money, she would stand by the terrace window and watch the mid-autumn moon. It was still a moon that held the memory of childhood harvests and the smell of her grandmother's tea. Julian would appear at her elbow without a sound and stand there with her, not pressing, not demanding. They watched the city breathe beneath them. The cameras could try to reduce their lives to a few frames, but the moon was indifferent to such cruelty. It offered a clarity that was not public, a cool, steady light you could only really see if you allowed yourself to look. "People will talk," Julian said once, not as a warning but as a fact. "We cannot stop them all. We can only choose which voices matter." Clara learned to speak in those voices. At a quiet press briefing, she read from a short statement she had helped draft. The cameras closed in, their lenses glinting like thoughts. "My family and I are committed to transparency as we work to repair the business," she said, and her voice did not tremble. "We will pursue the truth and the responsible parties, and we will protect our employees and partners." After the cameras left, a reporter lingered. "What about the USB?" he asked. The question was a small grenade in polite clothes. "We are investigating all lines of evidence," Clara replied. Her hand found Julian's, brief, in the press of a camera buffer zone, and the reporter wrote it down like a promise. She did not offer speculation. She did not relish the power of withholding drama. Power is not the same as cruelty. Not everyone accepted that restraint. Anonymous accounts on social platforms churned and offered up theories. The USB was a plant. Julian had orchestrated everything. Clara was a calculated pawn or a genius manipulator, depending on who wrote. These theories were recycled into comments and late-night talk segments and gutter-level op-eds. The noise could be corrosive if it went unanswered. It could also be ignored if you had proof. Clara's team focused on evidence. They mapped transactions, subpoenaed logs, traced communications. It was slow work, the kind of diligent, intelligent labor that made boring newspapers when it worked correctly, but was devastating to reputations when it did not. Julian admired Clara as she took to the work. She moved through it with a lightness that came from something other than ignorance. She had known fear and chosen to meet it. Ethan watched the thoroughness from the outside and felt his world narrow. He had been the center of his own drama for so long that its lack of consequence had become part of his self-image. Now consequences arrived like winter and did not knock but settled. He tried in small, clumsy ways to mend what he'd broken. He called once, voice low. "Clara," he said, as if the name itself could be an olive branch. She listened, polite but distant, and told him she had work to do. That evening, pushed by guilt and the furious solitude of a man who had never sat with himself, he went down to the marina where he'd once taken boats with Julian and their father. The clouds had opened and rinsed the world clean earlier. The dock smelled of salt and the sleeping tang of engines. Ethan walked alone, hands in his pockets, and for the first time in years thought about how his choices formed a pattern out of him. Regret is not a dramatic moment. It's a polite, invasive truth that lives in the margins and sharpens with silence. Back at the mansion, a staff member brought Julian a small, unassuming envelope. Inside was a printout, an anchor for a trail the legal team had uncovered. Routing numbers, a shell company's registered address, and, tucked in the middle, a list of names that would become keys to an argument. "They'll try to make this about us," Julian said after reading it, his jaw a slow, controlled line. "But we have to make it about the facts." Clara read the documents in the study under the pool of a desk lamp. Her handwriting, once neat and small in student notebooks, scrawled notes in the margins: contact, verify, corroborate. The USB had started as a scandal talisman and was becoming a ledger of responsibility. The realization that their enemies had planned with such intimacy, timing a scandal to the family's moment of vulnerability, fired through her like cold water. Someone had known how to make chaos out of grief, and the plan had nearly worked. Julian did not celebrate the find. He made a plan. He wanted to go legal, to tighten control, to call auditors, to bring in forensic accountants. Clara wanted action too, but she also wanted truth. "We cannot simply beat them with money," she said. "We have to show people exactly what they did and why." That night, as the house settled, she sat again by the window and held the wedding certificate, the same small white paper that had become a focal point for threads of rumor. The paper was suddenly heavier than it had been the day they signed it. It was both a shield and a declaration. She let herself imagine a future where being married to Julian did not mean living under a magnifying glass, but meant having a hand on the wheel of a company that fed many people and a voice in the choices it made. Ethan's isolation, measured not by dramatic gestures, but by absent invitations and muted feeds, continued to deepen. He was not yet ruined. The phrase was too flaying for that kind of slow erosion. He was, however, being forced into a quieter space where his antics no longer served him. He tried to set himself to work, to rebuild, but the same stubborn arrogance that had once been his charm now kept him from making the calls that mattered. He watched as Clara stepped into a dignity he had refused her when it was still possible to build a life beside her differently. The pain in him was not theatrical. It was the rawness of a man who had refused the map he'd been given and was now contemplating the cost of that refusal. In small ways, Clara's life began to change into what the tabloids would one day call royal. She did not inherit a crown, only responsibilities that required a steady spine. She hosted a charity luncheon in a modestly opulent hall where the elderly spoke and the cameras tried to pry into quiet moments. She gave a speech about employees and trust and the dignity of labor, and people listened not because they had to, but because they believed the sincerity in her voice. Her photo circulated across the city like a soft correction to the scandalous frames that had come before. The caption underneath some pictures read simply, "Clara Bell, new face of stability." This was not revenge. It was not triumph over a man in ruins. It was a slow reweaving of reputation that relied on work, not on hostile spectacle. Julian watched this with a protective pride that slid sometimes into something like affection. He invited her to sit in a board meeting as an observer. She asked a question about a supplier line and found that men who had once brushed her aside clicked open their ears. There was a small, fierce satisfaction in that. She felt like a person who had learned to carry more than grief. But the story was not yet done. The USB trail led, in scattered ways, to people whose motivations were not as simple as hatred. There were competitors in the wings, yes, but also old grudges and opportunistic advisors who had seen an opening. The forensic team traced half a dozen emails, a transfer that tipped toward a shell company, and something else, the faint suggestion that someone inside Bell had been bribed to slow a contract. Those were more dangerous findings than a tabloid could make out. They were the sort of thing that could not be resolved with a single press release. Clara understood this. Power had a cost. Protecting the company would demand not only money, but a willingness to cut out the rot, to confront people she might have to fire or expose. She had always been gentle by nature, but gentleness in leadership could be fierce. The kind of queen she wanted to be would not be ornamental. She had no interest in ruling with vindictiveness. She wanted to rule with the rounded weight of accountability. At the edge of the month, when the moon swelled full, and the air smelled like wood smoke and baked pears, Clara sat with Julian on the terrace. The company was no longer bleeding in the way it had been. The immediate liquidity issue had been staunched by a private loan Julian arranged, but the structural problem remained. Their team had prepared a meeting with the board to present the evidence they had compiled. They would ask permission to pursue a legal course that would be public and painful. "If they find out we go public, they'll make us look small," Julian said, his voice even. "They will try to paint you as fragile and irresponsible." Clara turned to him. "They will always try to make us small," she said. "We are small only if we let them define us. We define ourselves by what we put back together." He watched her, and, for the first time since they had married, the protective line around him softened. He reached for her hand, and he did not let it go because the gesture was about more than comfort. It was an agreement. There are many kinds of marriage: transactional, sacrificial, antagonistic. As the moon leaned over them, Clara felt theirs settle into something more complicated, an alliance that might one day become tenderness. The next morning, before the board meeting, news feeds buzzed with old clips of Ethan and Skyler, and an anonymous post that suggested deeper collusion. It was ominous but not conclusive. Clara read it, felt the small flinch of irritation, and then folded the paper into the folder that contained the evidence from the USB. They were ready to move, but they needed to move carefully. Public exposure without an ironclad case could backfire. The legal team had prepared a sealed motion. The PR team had a release prepped and edited in a dozen tones. The board would decide. As the car pulled away to the boardroom, Clara thought of the photograph that had launched all of it. The USB sitting on the bar floor like trash and like a talisman. Some small thing had started a chain of events that would change many lives. She did not imagine then the depth of the unspooling to come. She only knew this. She had married Julian to protect more than reputation. She had married to claim an agency that had been denied her. That agency required a voice, a sharpness, and sometimes a willingness to make choices that would leave men like Ethan reckoning with the shape of their regrets. The car cut through the city with a hush. Lights slid by like blinking eyes. Clara straightened her shoulders and tucked her hand into Julian's as if to anchor herself, and somewhere a new headline began to write itself. One that would not be satisfied with scandal and would insist on consequences. The car hummed like a held breath as it cut through the city toward the boardroom, streetlights pooling on the leather seat beside Clara like a procession of small witnesses. She kept the folder on her lap, the papers inside organized in her handwriting, dates, transaction trails, emails flagged in neat ink. It felt strange to be the one carrying the ledger of other people's betrayals. Stranger still to realize that the weight of proof had become something she could lift. If you love twists of love and power, stay with this one. They entered the boardroom to a room of faces that measured the world in percentages and reputations. Some wore the look of old alliances, polished, careful, while others had the mild impatience of those used to making urgent decisions by phone. Julian sat beside Clara with a steadiness that had become as much a part of their public script as the wedding photograph had been. He did not sit like a man who owned the room. He sat like a man who intended to ensure it stayed intact. The legal team presented the findings in a language of numbers and timestamps. The USB, when the IT director took the podium, was described with the technical calm that removes romance from scandal. Metadata, server paths, an IP address that bent back toward a shell company registered overseas. The forensics report matched the timing of a delayed signature on a key supplier contract. A transfer had been rerouted through an intermediary, its paper trail carefully disguised, but not clever enough to avoid a persistent audit. Names surfaced like mines along a coastline, consultants who had favored certain suppliers, a rival firm with a history of dirty work. An internal advisor whose loyalties had not been as clean as his resume implied. There were objections? A few board members worried about the optics of a public legal fight. Others fretted over the potential for counter-litigation. One older director, a man who had seen companies fall, snapped that revenge could be expensive and messy, and that Bell needed to think like a business, not a tribunal. Julian answered with the precise economics of risk management, how an unresolved smear could bleed capital, and how a public, fact-based strategy could close the wound faster than silence. Clara watched him and saw, not the calculating air from tabloids, but the man who had read through legal exhibits until midnight, because he believed the company was not an asset to be safeguarded for the sake of posture, but a community of livelihoods. When discussion turned to Clara, there was a ripple, some subtle freedom of surprise that she expected. She had not been there to perform, she had been there to present the truth as she understood it. She stood, voice steady, and asked for a minute to speak, not as the bride on their family feed, but as someone who worked nights to understand red lines and balance sheets, as someone who had seen what panic does to vulnerable hands. "We have a choice," she said. "We can let rumor be the narrative, or we can document the truth and let it stand on its own. Evidence does not court headlines, it has its own language. If we do this carefully, we not only protect Bell, we protect the people who depend on it. That is what I want my name to stand for." Her words landed with the odd soft force of someone newly authorized to care. The chairman, a reserved woman who had rarely offered visible warmth, glanced at Julian and then at the board. "I want to see the motion," she said. "We proceed with the investigation, and on counsel's advice, go public with the facts at the right moment." It was a narrow victory and a necessary one. They authorized subpoenas, hired forensics, and instructed the PR team to prepare a statement that prioritized clarity over spectacle. Julian arranged the private credit line to shore up short-term liquidity. Clara insisted on transparency in how those funds would be used. It pleased some and unsettled others that she wanted a clear, accountable plan for the loans. There would be no shadow bailouts under their watch. Preparation was a meticulous choreography. Forensic accountants dug into layers of transactions. Communications were preserved and logs subpoenaed. An outside firm cross-checked the shell company registrations. The USB's files, once corroborated against server backups and internal records, formed a mosaic. No single damning clip, but a series of inconsistencies that together told a story of deliberate slowing of contracts to benefit an external bidder. The legal team built an argument around intent and pattern rather than sensation. Public exposure was staged with the same care. The press release emphasized facts, dates, actions, and the names of firms implicated in the diversion of funds. Clara would not be the one to sensationalize. She would be the one who calmly handed the public a document and said, "This is what happened. We will pursue it." The PR team crafted the narrative to leave no opening for conjecture. Social media would find angles, of course. It always did. But when a story was laid out in black and white, the gossip channels had less purchase. On the day of the release, cameras clustered like curious birds outside the Bell headquarters. Clara stood at a podium with Julian to her side, a physical arrangement that read, to the press, as joint stewardship. She read the prepared statement. Her voice did not waver. "Today, we are releasing evidence supported by independent forensic accounting that shows coordinated interference with our supplier agreements," she said. "We have engaged the authorities and will cooperate fully. We will also hold accountable anyone who sought to profit from the company's weakness." The reporters, hungry for the angle that killed or saved reputations, asked their sharp, leading questions. Clara answered with facts and a refusal to indulge theatrics. She refused to turn the moment into a spectacle of blame. "This is not about humiliation," she said at one point. "It is about responsibility." The evidence shifted the conversation. The tabloids, forced to chase verifiable claims, pivoted from insinuation to reporting. Headlines softened from scandal to investigation underway. The USB stopped being a cosmic talisman in gossip threads and became a piece of hardware in a narrative of corruption. People who had cheered Ethan's reckless theater found themselves confronted with the dry ledger of financial harm. For some, the realization was small and private. For others, it was a theatrical fall. Ethan watched the pivot as if watching a play in which he had once had lines but now sat mute. The script changed without his consent. He paced his apartment, his phone a small accusing glow that showed messages he could not face. Skyler Moon's name hummed in the background of interviews. Her agent sent terse statements and moved to distance her client from the legal storm. Friends who had once toasted his headlines began to decline invitations that involved producing footage. The world narrowed to a series of absentees: a mate who didn't pick up, a mentor who didn't return calls, a feed that now hosted other people's faces. He tried to insert himself into the story in the one way he knew how: by being seen. He attended parties, made a show of laughter, posted contrite-looking selfies with ambiguous captions. But the feeds had already begun to test new narratives. People saw not a comeback, but the repetition of an old pattern. When he turned to the Bells with a message that tried to pivot guilt to pleading, his words became another kind of proof. A younger brother asking for clemency from a woman whose life he had once expected to be part of. He requested a meeting with Clara. The request was awkward, the sort of thing men like him never asked when they were younger. An admission softened by the shape of loneliness. Julian arranged the meeting in a neutral room. No cameras, no staff standing in hallways. It was an adult, private arrangement meant to avoid spectacle. Clara agreed with the simple economy of someone who understood closure sometimes needed a formal setting. Ethan arrived with an apology that read like a script that had been revised too late. "I messed up," he said. For once I wanted a life that wasn't planned." His voice was quieter than she remembered under the neon and the headlines. There was no performative swagger left, only the hollow of someone who had learned that consequence would not roll away for him. Clara listened. She did not let herself be shamed into theatrical forgiveness. She heard instead the man who had refused a map that might have led to different choices for both of them. "I know what you wanted," she said, careful and calm. "But other people paid for the way you chose to live. You must understand that." "I do," he said, with the small honesty that comes when performance cracks. "I do. I don't expect you to. I don't know what I expect, Clara. Maybe just to say I'm sorry, like it matters." "It matters if it's true," Clara answered. "But words alone won't fix the contracts, the suppliers, the employees who worried about their paychecks. You left a lot of things unsettled when you walked away. The people who paid for that didn't get apologies. They need responsible action." He sat, a defeated figure, not humiliated so much as emptied. "Will they be okay?" he asked, the question not about himself but about Bell, the name that had been a family roof and now a ledger of lives. It was the first time he had asked such a thing with more than rhetoric. "They will be," she said. "We already have plans in motion." Her voice softened in that sentence, not in forgiveness but in the recognition that some ties, once ruptured, demand repair beyond phrases. The meeting did not produce dramatic reconciliation. It produced a sober exchange, a recognition of what had been lost and what could never be reclaimed simply through apology. Ethan left with his shoulders a little more slumped, holding a small stubborn ember of shame that had finally warmed into an honest ache. Publicly, the legal machinery moved. Authorities announced inquiries into the shell companies named in the filings. A mid-tier competitor, a firm that had recently bid on a Bell subcontract and had existing ties to several suspicious intermediaries, found itself under scrutiny. Journalists who had once traded in rumor now wrote about subpoenas and indictments. The slow, grinding mechanisms of regulatory accountability began to turn. There were human consequences, less cinematic than headlines suggested, but more durable. The internal advisor whose name surfaced as a middleman in the diverted payments was suspended pending investigation. A consultant who had been seen at late dinners with rival partners was put on leave. The firm that had profited from the stalled contract faced inquiries that would, in months to come, cost it far more than any sensational headline might imply. Bell Corporation did not instantly heal. There were weeks of tense negotiations, suppliers who asked for guarantees, partners who required audited assurances. Julian's private loan kept the most immediate fears at bay. Clara spearheaded a team to review the contracts and to set up a new oversight committee to prevent similar breaches. She insisted on a transparent process, quarterly summaries for stakeholders, anonymous reporting channels for internal whistleblowers, and a public statement on ethics and procurement that included independent audits. These moves slowly altered public sentiment. The portrait of Clara, as just another bride, faded into the portrait of Clara the leader, someone who could both feel and act. People began to see her not as a pawn but as a steward. Her charity work, once dismissed as PR, took on substance when she visited a factory to speak with employees on a gray morning and asked questions about safety measures. Her presence was not performative, it was inquisitive and practical. Workers told reporters they felt heard. Those quotes, small and honest, turned into the quiet currency that rebuilds trust. Julian watched her with a pride that was equal parts professional respect and something softer. He invited her input on restructuring plans and listened when she suggested a community fund to help those temporarily affected by the corporate turmoil. He did not treat her suggestions as pet projects, he implemented them. Power, they both learned, becomes respectable when it is used in plain, unglamorous work. Behind the scenes, their relationship folded into a new grace. There were nights when they spoke about trivial matters, what soup to stock in the pantry, a portrait that needed restoring, and nights when they sat in the study and read, not side by side for show, but because company and comfort had found a companionable intersection. One evening, after a long day of hearings, they walked through the mansion's little garden where lanterns softened the hedges into gentle silhouettes. Julian stopped and looked at her as if weighing an answer to a question he had not yet voiced. "I admire how you carry yourself," he said quietly. "You could have retreated. You chose to act." Clara met his eyes. It was one of those small exchanges that mattered quietly. "I could have been angry," she said. "Anger is a language too, but not the one I want to speak from the terrace." She smiled then, a brief, honest curve that seemed to surprise both of them. "I want to build something that lasts." They stood in the dim light, hands finding each other without pretense. There was a tenderness there that had nothing to do with tabloids and everything to do with two people who had found a steady rhythm. One night, some months later, when the city had settled into a hush and the rain tapped at the windows in a waltz of old memory, they shared an evening that felt like a tacit agreement to allow intimacy to grow. They cooked a simple meal together, two people unremarkable in a world that expected spectacle. And afterward, Julian took Clara's hand and led her to a small room upstairs he had prepared weeks before. Books in neat rows, a soft rug, a lamp that diffused light like honey. They talked then, not as husband and heir, but as two people trying to name their fears and their hopes. Clara spoke of her parents, of the quiet courage she had learned in a small kitchen with tea-stained cups. Julian spoke of expectations and the loneliness of command. Neither offered grand gestures. They offered their time, their presence, and consent, each gesture deliberate, each touch chosen. In that room, away from cameras and the itch of feeds, a small thing unfurled, a mutual affection that respected boundaries and nurtured agency. Meanwhile, the public arc of Ethan's downfall took a different shape. He had not been a villain in the criminal sense. His choices had been personal and selfish rather than felonious. But the erosion of his social capital was real. Contracts he had once secured with ease no longer trusted his name. An agency that had been courting him politely declined after the scandal deepened. Friends who once cheered his exploits now kept their distance, uncomfortable with the way his headlines had cost people their livelihoods. He found himself in rooms where his charm didn't quite fit. Invitations dwindled, and the noise that had once cushioned him became a chronic ache. He attempted grand apologies in venues that felt performative. They landed flat. In movies and tabloids, he was sometimes portrayed as the reckless golden boy whose choices had consequences. In private, he was gutted by the simpler, sharper truth. He had walked away from a map and now realized the map may have been offered to him for reasons that mattered beyond his selfish wants. One evening, months after the initial scandal, he stood on a pier and watched the city lights bloom across the water. The tide lapped at the pilings and a cool breeze took the edge off a September heat. He scrolled through his phone and found images of Clara speaking at a public forum, her profile lit by the lights from the stage as she spoke about corporate responsibility. The caption read, "Clara Bell, Stewardship in a New Era." He stared at it until the screen blurred. There was no dramatic collapse. There was the slow, inward shattering of a man who realized that decisions accumulate into a shape that cannot be smoothed out with an apology. He reached out in smaller ways, calls to mentors, attempts to volunteer for causes to regain a sense of purpose, but doors stayed politely ajar or closed. The social circuits he had once thought endless were finite, and he navigated their borders with a new chastened humility. The cameras stopped dramatizing his lateness to proms and instead documented his absence from events that mattered. Friends married, others moved cities, and he was left measuring time in quiet rooms. There was, however, an ember of mercy in the way Belle and Clara chose to act. Their recoveries were not predicated on dramatic banishment. When the internal inquiry reached its conclusions, there was a line in the public report that read simply, "Wrongdoing by a small number of external actors has been referred to authorities for adjudication." The report did not bathe in humiliation, it sought justice. Some individuals were sanctioned, some firms faced fines, and a few reputations were tarnished beyond repair. Bell Corporation, after a season of rework and legal cost, stabilized and continued its projects with clearer oversight. Clara never staged Ethan's ruin as a spectacle. The narrative the tabloids had once sought, of a vengeful bride, did not fit the woman she had become. Instead, in board meetings and town halls, she argued for protections that would prevent other families and employees from being collateral damage in private dramas. She introduced an employee assistance fund for those affected by corporate disruptions and an independent review panel for procurement. These were quiet policies that bore no glamour on their own, but that mattered to the people who needed them. Her public life acquired a kind of royalness that was not a crown, but a steadying hand. The way she walked through factory floors and made eye contact, the way she insisted on reporting lines that people could trust. The press began to call her the face of Bell's new ethos, and the nickname sank into public imagination not as mockery, but as a shorthand for her fortitude. The mid-autumn moon came round again, swollen and bright, and the town's lantern festivals breathed a softer note into the season. Clara and Julian sat on the terrace, wrapped in blankets as a cool wind teased the edges of their conversation. The mansion below them hummed with ordinary life, staff doing their late checks, a cook testing a sauce, a gardener sweeping dry leaves into neat piles. The portraits inside looked on with the same solemnity as before, but the air around them had changed. There was less of the urgent glare of crisis and more of the patient work of stewardship. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of this had happened?" Julian asked, not as a dare but as a curiosity. Clara listened before answering. She thought of a small apartment with books stacked like barricades and the kettle still warm, of a grandfather who had believed in promises, of a boy with a reckless grin. "Sometimes," she said, "I think of a life quieter than this, but I also think that quiet is not always better. We've had to make hard choices. We chose them." He watched her, the moon turning their skin silver. "You chose wisely," he said. "Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary." She smiled at the phrase and at the gentle certainty in his voice. "Living like a queen," she mused, "isn't about silk and jewels. It's about being given authority and using it so that fewer people are hurt." He nodded, and for a long moment they were silent together, the city a soft constellation below. Somewhere a festival speaker hummed a folk tune, distant and sweet. She thought of Ethan and the arc that had led him here, the choices that made a man smaller not by force but by consequence. She felt pity, an unobtrusive, inevitable compassion that did not excuse his behavior but recognized that people can be both perpetrators and victims of their own patterns. Ethan, in the months that followed, tried to build a life outside the circuits that had defined him. He took work that did not invite cameras, he sought counseling, and he moved briefly to another city where his name meant less. He wrote a letter to Clara once, not a public plea but a private acknowledgement. A few lines that said he was sorry and that he was trying to be different. She read it quietly and responded with a note that closed with a measured blessing. "Take care of yourself." The city watched the transformation, Clara rising into authority, Julian steady at her side, Ethan shrinking into the margin of his own making, and the tabloids tried to invent epilogues that were crueler than reality. But the truth is seldom so neat. Clara's life did become more luminous in the way the tabloids mean. She was photographed in events with bright gowns. She hosted galas that raised real money, and she oversaw contracts that helped reopen stalled projects. Yet the real change was less about appearance and more about substance. The people who worked for Bell felt the difference in broken promises kept and in the new review panels that punished conflicts of interest. In time, the legal cases produced indictments against the external actors who had orchestrated the diversion. Some were fined, some faced reputational ruin. A few faced more severe consequences depending on how far their actions bent the law. Bell Corporation recovered enough confidence to resume halted projects, and Clara's steady presence became a stabilizing factor in investor meetings. She was invited to speak on panels about corporate ethics, and she spoke with the same quiet force she used in the boardroom. Facts first, dignity always. At the center of it all, the wedding certificate she had once held like a small shield lived now as a quiet piece of paper in a drawer, no longer a talisman to ward off rumor, but a record of a choice. She had not married to enter into a gilded cage, she had married to gain a voice. That voice had not been a trumpet of vengeance, but an instrument of repair. The final images that would attach themselves to the lore of the story were not cinematic retributions, but domestic, measured scenes. Clara overseeing a new facility opening that provided jobs to a neighborhood. Julian standing at her elbow in a photo that spoke of partnership rather than ownership. An older director who had once doubted her extending a hand of public commendation. Ethan's image, by contrast, receded into the quieter reels. A man of faded glamour who had been forced to confront the consequences of choosing freedom without regard to the others, it would hurt. There was no triumphant, gloating sequence where she stepped onto a balcony and flattened a broken man beneath a heel. The ending was not a punishment spelled out in headlines. It was a reweaving of life into shapes that made new sense. She lived like a queen, not because she wore crowns, but because she used the authority she had been given to protect, to repair, and to insist on dignity where gossip would have had cruelty. He was broken, not by a vengeful hand, but by the quiet arithmetic of his own choices. Doors closed, trust eroded, the small stinging realization that impulsive freedom carried costs he had not accounted for. On a mid-autumn night, the moon full and pale, Clara and Julian walked through a quiet festival. Lanterns bobbed like distant stars, and the air smelled faintly of baked pears. They paused beneath a tree and watched families move by, people whose lives were connected in ways that had nothing to do with fame. She thought of the orphaned girl who had once packed a chipped mug into a small box, and felt a long, soft current of sadness for the life that had been lost to her, as well as gratitude for what she had gained. Someone nearby laughed, unselfconsciously. The sound landed in Clara's chest like a bell. Julian slipped his hand into hers. They watched the moon together, not as conquerors, but as stewards of a fragile, complicated world. "Do you ever think we'll forget the noise?" she asked. "Maybe not forget," he answered, "but we'll learn how to live past it." She let out a small breath and felt the line of tension in her shoulders unwind. The city breathed around them, and the headlines had long since moved on to other spectacles. The wedding certificate would remain a small document in a drawer. The USB would be evidence filed away in archives. Ethan would find a path that did not include the public adulation he once sought. The story would be told in many ways, but the truth that mattered was simple. She had made a choice, and from that choice, she had forged a life that encompassed agency, dignity, and responsibility. She married her cheating ex's brother, one tabloid might still write in a breathless tone. The rest of the world, the people who actually mattered to the life of the company and to the neighborhoods it fed, had a quieter headline. She married into responsibility and used her voice to hold power to account. If Clara could have a single wish, it would not be for vindication. It would be for fewer people to be hurt by other people's choices. That wish felt like a crown, heavier than any jeweled circlet, weighty, real, and oddly liberating. If Clara's story moved you, like and subscribe for more dramatic, true-to-life twists, and tell us in the comments, who do you think deserved what in the end?